In the heat of a live broadcast in Boston, Peter Farrelly suddenly erupts, calling Caroline Leavitt's words a filthy lie. The audience gasps as she, burning with anger, rips off her microphone and throws back a challenge. The cameras capture the tension. Viewers hold their breath. What will happen next? If you want to find out what happened after that, hit like and subscribe. Now let's dive into the story. In the studio of a television network in downtown Boston, the air buzzed with tension. Peter Farrelly, a renowned director with gray at his temples and deep wrinkles etched by years of reflection, sat on the left. His gaze was calm, but there was a spark in his eyes, the kind that appears when someone knows the truth is on their side. Across from him sat Caroline Leavitt, a young political commentator with perfectly styled hair and a sharp tongue that had made her a darling of the conservative media. She adjusted her microphone, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the anticipation of battle. The host, a man with silver hair and an overly broad smile, began the show. Tonight, we're talking about trust in government, about truth and lies in politics. Peter, Caroline, you both have strong opinions on the matter. Peter, let's start with you. You recently said that modern politics is theater of the absurd. What did you mean by that? Peter leaned forward, his voice low but clear as a bell. I meant that people are tired of being manipulated. We see politicians and commentators twist facts to feed their supporters. It's not about dialogue, it's about winning at all costs. And I believe that's destroying the country. The room fell silent. A few older audience members nodded, their faces showing a mix of agreement and disappointment. Caroline smiled, but her eyes narrowed. Peter, that sounds very sweet, but let's be honest, she said, her voice sharp as a blade. You're part of Hollywood, which has been selling us fairy tales about morality for years while drowning in scandals. Why should we believe you over the people actually fighting for this country's values? Peter raised an eyebrow but didn't look away. I'm not selling fairy tales, Caroline. I tell stories about real people, with their pain and hopes. And what are you selling? Slogans? Fear? The crowd stirred. The host tried to step in, but Caroline was already on the offensive. You call that fear? I call it truth. People want safety, jobs, respect for tradition. And your films just pour fuel on the fire of division. Peter clenched his fists onto the table, but his face remained composed. He knew moments like these were traps. One careless phrase, and headlines would scream about his meltdown. But something in Caroline's tone, smug, almost contemptuous, got to him. Caroline, he said, his voice quieter now, but piercing. You're repeating the same lines I've heard from dozens of politicians. And you know what? They sound like lies. Dirty, cynical lies meant to make people afraid of each other. The room gasped. Caroline froze, her cheeks flushed. The host jumped in, trying to defuse the situation. Well, that's a strong statement, Peter. Caroline, what do you have to say? But Caroline wasn't listening. Her eyes burned with anger. Are you calling me a liar? Me? Her voice cracked into a shout. I represent millions of people who are tired of people like you. The elite who think they're smarter than everyone else. I didn't call you a liar, Peter replied calmly, though a steeliness crept into his eyes. I said your words are lies. And I'm ready to explain why. The room erupted in applause and shouts. The older viewers, who remembered when debates were about ideas rather than yelling, looked at Peter with curiosity. A woman in glasses, sitting in the third row, whispered to her neighbor, "He's not backing down." That's something new. But Caroline wasn't giving up. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone? I won't let you use me for your PR. Peter sighed, his shoulders lowering. He didn't want war. But he wasn't going to stay silent either. I'm not doing PR, Caroline. I want us to talk like people, not like actors in a bad show. Please sit down. Let's work through this. She didn't sit. Instead, she turned to the host. This is unacceptable. I demand an apology. The host blinked in confusion, his smile fading. Peter, maybe you should clarify. I will, said Peter, his voice still steady, but now carrying weight. Caroline, I'm not attacking you as a person. But when you say your words are the truth of millions, You ignore the other millions who think differently. You divide people into us and them. And I believe that's wrong. Caroline opened her mouth, but found nothing to say. The room buzzed louder this time. A man in a plaid shirt patted his neighbor on the shoulder. Damn, he got her. But what's she going to do now? Peter leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. He knew he crossed a line, but not the one Caroline thought. He hadn't tried to destroy her. He wanted her to stop and think. And not just her, but everyone watching the show. People at home, in bars, in their living rooms, remote in hand. Caroline finally sat down, her face pale. She looked at Peter as if seeing him for the first time. The host, sensing the situation slipping out of control, announced a break. We'll be back after the commercial. Don't go anywhere. When the cameras shut off, Peter stood and walked to the water table. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He knew this was just the beginning. Caroline, speaking with an assistant in the corner of the studio, shot him a quick glance. In her eyes was something new, not just anger, but doubt. Behind the scenes, technicians buzzed, a makeup artist touched up the host, and the audience whispered among themselves. The woman in the third row, clutching her purse on her lap, said, I thought he was just a director. But he's saying what we're all thinking. Her neighbor, a man with a mustache and a worn hat, nodded. Yeah, but this isn't over. She's not the type to back down. Peter stood by the window, looking out at the lights of Boston. He felt that tonight would change everything, not just for him or Caroline, but for everyone who was listening. But how far was he willing to go? And what would happen when the cameras came back on? When the commercial break ended, the studio was once again flooded with blinding spotlight. The audience, seated in their places, scrolled through their phones or whispered to each other, but their eyes were glued to the stage. Tension hung in the air, like the moment before a decisive punch in a boxing ring. Peter returned to his seat, his face calm, but his chest buzzing with intensity. Caroline sat across from him, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands tightly clasped on the table. She looked as if she were preparing for a counterattack. The host, sensing the show was teetering on the edge of chaos, hurried to take control. So, we're back to our heated discussion. Peter, Caroline, you've both made strong points. Let's try to find some common ground. Peter, why do you think Caroline's words are, as you put it, a dirty lie? Peter glanced at the host, then shifted his gaze to Caroline. He knew every word he spoke now carried more weight than ever. People at home, retirees, veterans, teachers on pensions, were watching him, waiting to see if he'd say what they were too afraid to voice. I'm not blaming Caroline personally, he began, his voice steady but laced with conviction. But when someone claims that one group of people has a monopoly on the truth, it cuts others out. It creates enemies where there don't need to be any. I grew up in Providence, in a neighborhood where Italians, Irish, and African Americans lived side by side. We argued, sure, but we talked. And now, we're just screaming at each other through screens. The room fell silent. A woman in the third row, Marge, a 67-year-old widow who went to church every Sunday, felt a lump in her throat. She remembered her husband, who always said, "Listen before you speak." Her neighbor, Fred, 72, a Vietnam veteran, nodded, clutching his hat on his lap. Peter was speaking their language, not loudly, but from the heart. Caroline, however, wasn't ready to back down. She leaned forward, her voice sharper. Peter, you tell touching stories, but that's not reality. Reality is people losing jobs because of the policies you support. Reality is cities where crime is rising because no one wants to take responsibility. You say I divide people? What about you, making films that glorify one side? Peter smiled, not with mockery, but with a hint of weariness. He'd heard this accusation 1,000 times. My films aren't about sides, Caroline. They're about people. About how we can be better, even when it feels like everything's lost. Have you seen Green Book? It's not about who's right. It's about two men who had no business connecting, learning to listen to each other. Caroline rolled her eyes, a move that didn't go unnoticed by the audience. Marge frowned, whispering to Fred, "She's not even trying to understand." But Peter didn't stop. He turned to the host. "That's what worries me. We've stopped listening. Caroline talks about crime, about jobs, and those are real issues. But instead of looking for solutions, we point fingers. I don't believe Caroline wants that. I think she believes in what she's saying. But belief doesn't make words true." The room erupted in applause. Caroline pressed her lips tighter, her eyes glinting, whether from anger or something else. It was hard to tell. The host, sensing the show was reaching a new peak, turned to Caroline. "Caroline, your response." She took a deep breath, her voice quieter but still sharp. "Peter, you think you can sit here and lecture me because you've made a few movies? I grew up in New Hampshire, in a town where people barely got by. I know what struggle is. And I won't let you demean my beliefs by calling them lies." Peter nodded, his eyes never leaving her. "I'm not demeaning you, Caroline. I'm saying we can both be wrong. And if we don't start talking to each other, instead of against each other, nothing will change." For a moment, silence fell. The audience held their breath. Marge clutched her purse, her heart pounding. She remembered how she used to settle fights between her kids. "Listen to each other," she'd say. "Just listen." Fred, who rarely showed emotion, felt a sting in his eyes. He thought of his old army buddies, how, despite their differences, they always found common ground over a beer. But Caroline wasn't ready for reconciliation. She stood abruptly, this time ripping off her microphone. "I'm not going to sit here and be lectured." Her voice trembled, more with pain than anger. "You don't know what I've been through to be here." She stormed off stage, leaving the studio in stunned silence. The host stood, flustered. Looks like we need another break." The cameras cut off, but the buzz in the room didn't fade. The audience whispered, argued, some even laughed. Marge turned to Fred. She ran off. But why? He wasn't attacking her. Fred shook his head. Maybe she's not used to someone talking to her, so. Calmly. Backstage, Peter sat in the green room, nursing a glass of water. His hands no longer trembled, but his mind raced. He didn't want Caroline to run. He wanted her to stay, not for the show, but for what could happen if they truly talked. Meanwhile, Caroline stood in the hallway, leaning against the cold wall. Her assistant, a young man in a suit, tried to comfort her. "You can go back and tear him apart. People will back you." But Caroline shook her head. Her eyes were wet, though she tried to hide it. "He's not fighting," she said quietly. "And that's what's most frustrating." She thought back to her childhood, a small town where everyone knew each other, where her father, a factory worker, told her, "Speak the truth, even if it hurts." But what if the truth she'd been defending wasn't the only one? The show's producer knocked on Peter's green room door. "She doesn't want to come back. What do we do?" Peter stood, his face resolute. "I'll talk to her." He found Caroline in the hallway. She looked up, her eyes flashing with defiance. But there was something else, vulnerability she hid behind her armor. "What do you want?" she snapped. "To talk," Peter said. "Not for the cameras. For us." She laughed, but it was bitter. "You think you can convince me? I'm not one of your movie characters." "I don't want to convince you," he replied. "I want to understand. And maybe for you to understand me." Caroline froze. No one had ever spoken to her like this, without shouting, without accusations. She looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of her dress. "Why do you care?" she asked softly. "Because I believe we can be better," Peter said. "Not me, not you. All of us." They stood in silence, the muffled hum of the studio the only sound. The audience waited, the cameras were ready, but in that moment it all felt irrelevant. Marge and Fred, sitting in the audience, didn't know what was happening backstage, but they sensed something shifting. When the show resumed, Caroline returned to her seat. Her makeup was slightly smudged, but she held her head high. Peter sat across from her, his gaze warm but not patronizing. The host, sensing a change in the air, started cautiously. "Caroline, we're glad you're back. What do you want to say?" She took a deep breath, her voice softer than before. I don't agree with Peter. But he's right about one thing. We've stopped listening. And maybe I have too. The room fell silent. Marge squeezed Fred's hand, her eyes shining. Fred, who didn't care for sentiment, felt a smile tug at his lips. Peter nodded, his voice gentle. I don't want us to agree, Caroline. I want us to talk. For real. They continued the discussion, not without disagreements, but without shouting. They talked about taxes, education, the things that worried people. And though they didn't reach a consensus, something had changed. The audience saw not two enemies, but two people trying to understand each other. When the show ended, the room erupted in applause. Marge and Fred stood with everyone else, their hearts beating faster. They didn't know what would happen next, whether this show would change the country or remain just a moment. But they felt hope. Maybe Peter and Caroline's small step was the start of something bigger. Peter and Caroline left the studio together, not as friends, but as people who saw more in each other than an enemy. The lights of Boston glowed outside the window, and in their shine, there was a promise of a new day. The studio gradually emptied. The audience, still discussing what they'd seen, slowly spilled onto the cold Boston streets, where the smell of wet asphalt mingled with the aroma of coffee from a nearby diner. Marge, clutching her purse, lingered at the exit to thank Fred for his company. Her eyes sparkled with emotion. You know, Fred, I didn't think I'd see something like that on TV, she said, adjusting her scarf. They didn't agree, but they listened. That's something, isn't it? Fred, usually reserved, nodded, his mustache twitching slightly in a smile. It's more than I've seen in the last 10 years. Maybe there's still hope. Meanwhile, backstage, Peter and Caroline stood in a quiet hallway, away from the bustle of technicians packing up cables. The cameras had long been turned off, the spotlights dimmed, but the tension between them hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted, becoming less sharp but deeper. Caroline held a water bottle, her fingers nervously twisting the cap. Peter stood across from her, his hands in the pockets of an old coat he'd thrown on after the show. I didn't expect to come back, Caroline said, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. I thought I'd just leave and write an angry post on social media. That would have been easier. Peter smiled, his eyes looking at her, without judgment. Easier, but not better. You came back, Caroline. That's already a step. She glanced at him, her brows slightly furrowed. Do you really believe in all this? All this talk about being better? Or is it just your director's trick? Peter sighed, his gaze growing more serious. I grew up in a family where we argued about everything at the dinner table, from politics to who played better for the Red Sox. But we always ended the night together, laughing. I'm not saying we can bring those times back, but I believe we can at least try. Otherwise, why are we here? Caroline fell silent. Her thoughts drifted to her hometown in New Hampshire, where neighbors helped each other after snowstorms, where her mother baked pies for the whole street after elections, regardless of who won. She remembered how she once believed truth could unite, not divide. But somewhere amid the whirlwind of talk shows and loud headlines, she'd lost that. I'm not promising we'll be friends, she said finally, her voice firmer but without hostility. And I'm not changing my views. I'm not asking you to, Peter replied. Just, let's not stop talking, even if it's hard. They exchanged a look, not warm, but honest. Caroline nodded, almost imperceptibly, and walked toward the exit where her assistant was waiting. Peter stayed behind, watching her go. He didn't know if he'd see her again, but he felt this evening wasn't just an episode of a show. It was the start of something, however small. The next morning, Boston was abuzz with news. Clips from the broadcast spread across social media. Headlines screaming, Farrelly versus Leavitt. Clash or dialogue? Can a conversation change America? But for Marge and Fred, sitting over breakfast at a local diner, it wasn't about the headlines. They sipped coffee, listening to the hum of other patrons, and shared their thoughts. I wrote a letter to the network, Marge admitted, her cheeks slightly flushed. I said I want more shows like that. where people talk, not yell. Fred raised an eyebrow, but his eyes shone with approval. Good for you, Marge. And I think I'll talk to my grandson. He thinks us old folks don't get it. Maybe I'll tell him about last night. They laughed, their laughter blending with the clink of spoons and the hiss of the coffee machine. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars honked, pigeons chased crumbs on the sidewalk, and the sky over Boston was clear, with faint, feathery clouds. Life went on, but for those who'd seen the broadcast, whether in the studio or at home in front of their TVs, something had shifted. Not the whole world, not all at once. But a small crack had appeared in the wall that divided people. Peter sat in his apartment, nursing a cup of coffee and flipping through letters from viewers that the producer had sent him. One was from Marge in Boston. "Thank you for reminding us what it's like to listen," she wrote. Peter smiled, his fingers lingering on the paper. He didn't know what would happen next, whether Caroline would continue this dialogue or revert to old patterns. But he knew he'd try again, and again. Because if two people could listen to each other, even for a moment, maybe others could too. Caroline, sitting on a plane to Washington, stared out the window at the clouds. Her phone buzzed with messages, some praising, others criticizing. But she didn't open any. Peter's words echoed in her mind, "We can be better." She wasn't sure she believed it. But for the first time in a long while, she wanted to find out. Thousands of miles away, in small towns and big cities, people talked about the broadcast. In a bar in Ohio, two men who always argued about politics bought each other a beer and decided to talk about something else. In a library in Georgia, a teacher organized a discussion for high schoolers, not about who was right, but about how to listen. In a church in Texas, a pastor quoted the show in his sermon, reminding his congregation that loving your neighbor starts with understanding. It wasn't a revolution. There were no grand victories or dramatic reconciliations. But there was a faint shift in the air, like the breath of spring after a long winter. And for those who'd seen Peter and Caroline take a step toward each other, it was enough. Enough to believe that a small conversation could be the start of a greater hope.